Hi, Kris.
Hi, Natalie. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so happy to see you. It is always fun to have a chance to talk with my friends.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And your career is one I admire so much. So I'm glad that we can share a little bit about it. But I will also say at the outset that some of what I really so admire about you, well, there's a lot, but your philosophy on teaching
Yes.
and your ability to tell great stories are also things that I think are exceptional and extraordinary. And I don't want to lose this chance to pull a little bit of that out in our conversation too.
That sounds like a lot of pressure, by the way. But now I
You
got to
have
have a
never.
story.
I don't think you ever wilt under pressure, Kris. So, I mean,
We'll see.
in fact, I think that you know, it, I think you and I both, and you more than me, but both of us, actually are people that when pressure ramps up, we do better. Like
Yes.
I think that in not emergency situations, but when decisions have to get made quickly or
Yes.
when something's on the line,
Yes.
we're both people that can go, okay, you do this and you do that, and let's
Yes.
get this done. So
Yes. Because sitting around and just worrying about it, then nothing happens.
right,
And so at
exactly.
least then you take some control and maybe you get to have a little bit of agency in what comes next. Yes.
Exactly.
So
So
I
I
agree with
think
that.
a little agency is what we both sort of go to naturally. And
Yes.
actually, it made me, in thinking about that, remember a story, but only part of a story, in which you were asked to rescue a piece of jewelry from a drain. All right. So maybe as a story, you can start with that one.
Yes. So I know where this story came from. There oftentimes we get asked the question, all of us, how we became interested in doing what we do. And I'm an engineer. I work with biological systems. So functionally, I feel like many times what's happening in my group is much more about biology, but I became an engineer kind of on purpose, right? Like I've always been very much interested in applications and in translation. And in tinkering. And I have to remind my students these days that I grew up in a world before there was an internet or a cell phone, right? Like imagine the world with no cell phones, without instant communication. Um, and I also grew up in a house with all women. So it was my mother, my sister, myself. My dad passed when I was very young, and so it was always just the girls. And so I was the boy of the girls. So this is the 70s and 80s, so very gender stereotypical. And I fixed stuff. That was just my job, was to fix stuff. If things were broken, I would fix it. I remember once using a safety pin to repair a leaking toilet. That was fun. The chain, a link had fallen off of the chain. So the chain wasn't quite long enough to reach the lever. And so I remember staring at it and thinking, what could I use that would connect these two pieces and actually hold? And a safety pin was the answer there. And so the story that you remember was one where I don't remember if it was my mother or my sister, but one of them sort of rushed out of the bathroom and was like, oh, I dropped a necklace in the sink. I'm like, stop. Don't turn on the water. And I open it up and sort of pull everything out. And we did have a toolbox of some sort. I don't know how, like, probably had one screwdriver and one wrench in it, but it happened to have a wrench that would actually fit. And I looked at it and just thought, well, it's in the U drain, right? It has to have stopped there, because I didn't know anything about fluid dynamics at the time, mind you. But if the water is off and there's no flow, there's nothing that's going to move it out of that drain. And so I just immediately went, I can get it, and grabbed a wrench and undid and plugged the drain, right? But then poured the water that was in the pipe in the drain, and the necklace pops out. And it must have been my sister, but it was like, oh, you got it. I'm like, yeah, I got it. Why wouldn't I get it? Right? Like, it's got to be in the drain. And so I was that kid, right? Which something is broken, and let me immediately try to move my mind to think about how to fix it with whatever tool. MacGyver, that was our version of like, yeah.
That's it. The safety pin. YouTube removal, all that, just MacGyver it.
MacGyver, yeah. And that's so I tell that story as an indication of my interest in engineering, right? And being able to make things, and build things, and if necessary, fix things, because a lot of engineering is about fixing the stuff that was wrong with your bad design.
Definitely.
Yes.
So the fearlessness. I mean, that's the other piece that I get from that story, is a willingness to just like try and hope it works. If it doesn't,
yes,
right?
Yes. Although I will say I am not. I have selective fearlessness. Right? There are certain things where I think, what's the worst that can happen? You have to just try. But there are others where I do find a bit of risk aversion in myself. Some of it is probably healthy, because I'm not gonna blow all my money on a bad investment, right? Because I'm suspicious of everybody. But it can make it difficult to try something to push far beyond the boundaries. So yes, I have to remind myself of that aspect of my personality quite often too.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I where you are now, I don't imagine there were a lot of people in Northeast Texas who were, doing the kind of work and the kind of career that you have right now. So there has to be an ability to sort of imagine something. So either you can imagine something that you can't see, or you just go and you don't care, right? You just go.
So in my story, there's a little bit of both of that, right? There's imagining what you can see, what you can't see, and there's the going part of it. So I will say, and they're both intertwined. I was going to see if I could figure out how to split them up, but I've told this story a lot, where I picked engineering as a major because my history teacher told me to. My history teacher told me to be an engineer, okay? Because she said, we had this conversation. I told her I like math and science. She said that's what engineering is. Now, I had done a book report or career report rather, on engineering as a discipline, on chemical engineering, actually, when I was in middle school. Totally forgot about it for like the next decade. So that wasn't in the forefront of my mind at all. And the same teacher said, if you're going to study engineering, you should go to MIT. So that was both imagining something that you hadn't seen. Because my response was, well, what is MIT? Right? Remember, no internet, right? No cell phone, right? No Iron Man yet. Right. So now kids know MIT because of Iron Man or the Big Bang Theory, right? Like none of those things kind of existed. People knew what Harvard was and what Yale was because there were movies from the 50s that talked about those places that would come on TV late at night. But MIT wasn't really known. And so part of it was just imagining the unknown in the sense of, well, okay, this is what this favorite teacher of mine whom I trusted, this is what she suggested I do if I was interested in engineering. It resonated with me when I thought, well, yeah, engineering, that sounds kind of like the stuff I've been doing, underneath the bathroom sink all these years. So that aspect of it was a little bit of pushing beyond the limits of what I knew. And then it was like, okay, well, let's just go for it, right? Like Miss Mears said, I should do it. Let me just do it. Right. I would argue that in some ways, my decision to pursue a PhD was more reckless than informed. It had no basis in anything that was thoughtful or was well informed. It was, wait a minute, you can have people call you doctor and not have to go to med school in order to do that. Well, that's interesting, right? And so I kind of set this goal that I was and I ended up at MIT as an undergrad. And then I always knew I was going to go to grad school because that's how I was going to be called doctor. And I didn't want to go to med school. I had crossed that off the list years earlier. And it wasn't until much further along that I was able to put the pieces together to figure out what that meant. Right. And, I have to say, though, I think we're in especially for young people of color, we are in a culture for good reason where we do want to push young people to go towards graduate school. And when people ask me to speak on panels about grad school, I always say that's fine as long as you're okay with me being honest and saying not everybody should do it, right? Like you should actually know what it's about, right? Like unlike I did, you should know what it's about before you declare this as a career aspiration, so that you go into it with much more of an open mind. So I would say, I have consistently, and I know more now. I have access to more information. So none of my decisions are most of my decisions are not as ill-informed as those first ones were. But I have always been the type of person to commit. Mm-hmm. Right. So even if I don't exactly know what's ahead of me, I'm committed to the process. Yeah. I'm committed to the journey. And I'm committed to the fact that I know I'm going to learn something new that I wasn't expecting. And I'm either going to go, well, boy, I wish I hadn't done that. Right.
Oops, big oops, right?
Or I'm going to go, that wasn't so bad, right? Like, maybe we'll ride this train a little bit further and see where the next stop is.
Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting. And it's funny. It reminds me a little bit. I also am sort of, I have a history of more reckless than informed decisions along my journey as well. I went to Cornell and studied chemistry because somebody said that would be a good thing to do. I was like, okay. Same idea. Go to MIT, study engineering. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's see. So MIT to Berkeley for
yes,
UC, and that was with Jay Kiesling. And
yes,
was that where you went from chem to bio? Engineering?
Yes, that it was where I went, although I had these interests early on. So one story I like to tell, very still dear family friend who's in his mid-80s now from my hometown of Longview, Texas, first introduced me to biotech and to chemistry as a platform for many different options in terms of career. He was a chemist by training, a PhD chemist, had been an academic chemist, so was a professor at the University of South Carolina, and then ended up moving back to Texas to take over the family business as his father had gotten older. And he kept this interest in education in small town East Texas and really tried to look for who he thought were people who could get out, right? I've come to believe that's sort of what he had in mind, which is I'm going to find the people who can leave and actually,
you get the ticket out,
right? and go explore and learn something new. And so I met him when I was a senior. I'd already applied to MIT. He actually is a MIT PhD alum in chemistry. And he handed me a couple of American Chemical Society publications on different areas of chemistry. One was on polymers and polymer science. The other was on biotech. And this would have been in late 1989, early 1990. AIDS crisis is full blown now. And biotech is it, right? Like this was the first time where in a relatively short period of time, a new disease had been definitively tied to this causative biological agent. They had a sequence. That was a big deal when you had like the sequence. Right. Of the HIV virus. And I remember reading this book about DNA and all the stuff you could do with DNA. And this is when we still thought cancer was going to be cured in 5 years. There was a rolling 5-year window for curing cancer at that point because antibodies were going to be the thing. And we had recombinant DNA technology so we could make any antibody we wanted to make. And it was going to cure all the cancers. You just needed the right one. And I was really fascinated by it. And then I read the polymer science one, and that sounded really cool and fascinating too. Again, right? Like just whatever came into my mind, it's very interesting. But I took the time at MIT as an undergraduate to explore both of those areas. I took a class that was a polymer science class. I took biochemistry offered by the chemistry department. The first year it was ever taught. It was a big deal because it was before 9 o'clock in the morning. Kids at MIT like to sleep late. So to fit it in, though, it was a new class, and it ran from 8:30 to 10 a.m. And I was like, well, can I get up at 8:30 to go to class? I don't know, right? Like, how bad do I want to learn this stuff? So that was biochemistry. And then I took biology, just sort of general biology, before it was required of all MIT undergraduates. And I did a year up as well in a lab. There was still chemical engineering, more fermentation process development. So not a lot of DNA, but moving towards the bio side. So when I went to Berkeley, I went there specifically interested in the bio stuff.
Got it.
right? So it was definitely the first time that I had a chance to do the biology at the molecular level. But that was purposeful. I chose it I chose it for two reasons. One was it was in California and I was cold. So I'd been in Boston for 4 years. My senior year was a really cold winter, not a lot of snow, but crazy cold winter. And I'd had enough, right? Like I'm like, you know, I gotta be done with this for a while. Put away the heavy boots. California seemed like a great place to be able to do that. And then I had, again, no internet. So when I was trying to figure out what schools to look at, I talked to my UROP supervisor, who was a professor named Charlie Cooney in the bio space, and said, where should I go to have choices, really? I knew, even then, I kind of knew it wasn't a good idea to be singularly focused on any one particular advisor. And so Berkeley was on the list. There were places like Minnesota, but that was too cold.
That one, you're not going to put your boots away.
No, but Berkeley was on the list, and they had, I should say, bio within chemical engineering was still relatively new at this point. And so the fact that Berkeley had 3 faculty, and Jay, my advisor, was the youngest of those 3, but 3 faculty who were really well versed in the biochemical side of chemical engineering, that was a huge driver and motivation for me to go to Berkeley for grad school.
That sounds amazing. You have a such a diversity of like experiences and backgrounds, and you've definitely like allowed the train to take you place to place.
Yes.
But I also know that you have ridden the train not only through academia, but also into industry and back.
That is right.
So do you have a story about either going towards industry or leaving industry, or your experience within industry that you?
I can. I think the story for why I went to industry and the story for why I left are both, I think, instructive and good ones. So in terms of why I went towards industry, I had always intended to do it. I'd forgotten it. I do a lot of writing stuff and then forgetting about it. Like I read the book report about the chemical engineer in 6th grade, I think it was, and forgot about it. When I wrote my statement of purpose for graduate school, which I did not find. So I graduated MIT in 94. So I would have written this in the fall of 1993. I found it 10 years later in 2004 when I was actually moving back to MIT. And in that statement of purpose, I had written, I wanted to get my PhD. I wanted to go spend some time in industry, and then I wanted to be a professor. Right? And then apparently, like I promptly forgot about that after I wrote it, because grad school was hard enough that it just washed all that stuff to the back of my brain. But while I was in grad school, I had a fellowship from DuPont. And as part of the fellowship, was required to go to what was called the Experimental Station, this really famous research center they had in Delaware, where they had over the years invented all sorts of stuff, including nylon and Teflon and these really, really creative scientists there. And I went to give this talk, my first full-length presentation. I'd done these conference things. There were 15 or 20 minutes here or there, but this was, you have the hour, you're supposed to spend 40, 45 minutes talking, and then the rest of the time for Q&A. No laptops then. So I had a binder with my overhead projector slides, right? And you had to have like the printed paper so I could actually read them, because the slides, we couldn't really read those on paper. So I'd studied everything. And I gave this talk that, as I like to say, that I thought was brilliant. I'm like, I nailed it, right? Like, I'm telling a couple of jokes and people are like really engaged and they're laughing and nodding along. We have this great Q&A afterwards. And I'm like, okay, my job here is done.
Right.
And then I don't remember if it was I don't think it was the immediate meeting after or one a little bit later. But Charlie Nakamura, God bless him, was a scientist at DuPont. And in a way that only Charlie could do. Charlie, when I met with him, I sat down and he said, I really enjoyed your talk. This is your motivation for doing it is totally wrong. But I enjoyed your talk.
Wait. I thought I was great.
I nailed it, Charlie. Like, did you see that? And I think he must have seen the look on my face, and he said, don't misunderstand me. I think what you're doing is very interesting. I think you're going to learn some things that are going to be really important for the field. And I think, you're going to write a paper about your major thesis project, and people within the metabolic engineering community are really going to appreciate it. But you've motivated your work by industrial concerns. And you're just wrong. Like, okay, well, enlighten me. And I don't remember the details anymore, but as most people teach you to do, I had 3 points, right? My 3 points for why this was important. And one of them, he was like, well, that used to be important, but we kind of figured out how to get around it. And because in industry, we don't publish everything we do, the academics just haven't quite caught up yet. That problem has been solved. The second one, this was never as big a problem as people thought it was in the first place. So yeah, you can do something, but it's not really going to be game changing. And the third, and I don't remember exactly what these were anymore, but the themes were the same. The third one, he said, no question, legitimately, that's a real problem. But you've got to solve these other 5 or 6 problems first before solving that one actually matters, right? So now, feeling suitably humbled, right? No longer feeling like I nailed it, right? It caused me to stop and think about the difference between industry and academia, right? The goals are different. The processes of doing research are different. The motivations are very different, right? And I was still interested in being an academic, but I wanted my research as much as possible to be relevant for industry. Right? Didn't mean that everything we did was going to be patentable or translatable, but I wanted to be able to have it be relevant. And in part, that was to be able to educate students, knowing that most of our students don't become professors. It's just there's not enough of us leaving for everyone that we educate to replace us, right? Like the math just doesn't work out there. So most of our students, by a pretty healthy margin, are not going into academia. They're doing something else. And so I wanted to have a perspective that allowed me to be a better mentor in a research lab. So for my graduate students, for my postdocs, and even in the classroom, there are certain things. I remember my first couple of years, I was teaching one class and I said, look, you're never going to use this. Actually, you're not going to do this when you're in industry. You don't have that kind of time, right? You don't have time to sit and optimize and build a detailed model, but you still need to learn this because number one, it's just good for your soul to be smart. So this is going to make you smart. So go ahead and learn it there. But you need to understand enough to learn from what other people have done and then apply those lessons to what's going to be useful for you. Right. And I didn't know that before I actually went to industry. I was trained as a very traditional chemical engineer. You study systems, you build these mathematical models and use the models to design whatever. That's great. But I worked in pharma. And pharma's like, this is the date we're going to launch. So this is the date where the process has to be set. So this is the date where you have to have your preliminary stuff done. And you do as much as you can within that time frame to meet whatever your performance specs are. Is it optimal? Probably not, right? Do you care? No, right? Like it's got to meet the objectives. Right. It doesn't have to solve all problems. And that's not how we're actually trained. I think and that's fine. I think that's appropriate for being trained in academia, but that's not really how people do things in industry. So I decided then like that, and I ended up that visit interviewing for a summer position. So I spent the summer at DuPont. And after the summer, definitely came away going, I want to spend real time in industry, learning all the ins and outs, understanding even what drives companies to adopt new technologies, and then go into academia. And so I went to Merck Research Labs in New Jersey, was really happy, right? Like liked my job, liked the people I worked with, probably would have stayed forever. And then my husband one day said, it's okay if you changed your mind, but when you took this job, you said you only wanted to do it for a couple of years. And then you were interested in being an academic. And it's been, I think it had been maybe 2.5 years at that point. And he said, if you change your mind and you like it and you want to stay, that's fine. But I don't remember the whole risk aversion thing. Right? He said, I don't want you to not try because this is comfortable. Yeah. And because it's easy, because it's sort of the devil you know versus the one that you don't. And so that's the second part of the story, which was that forced me to ask, what was it about my job that I liked at Merck most, right? What was the best part of it? And the best part of it, hands down, was that I had 2 young people who came to work for me, one fresh out of undergrad, one who had worked at Merck after undergrad for a couple of years, then gotten a master's degree. And I worked in sort of QC, so not in a research area, who were bequeathed to me, right, as young researchers. And I got to train them to be independent scientists. And I tell one last story here that to me, I'm like, this is why I'm here. We had every year, imagine if you did this in academia, every year we had these performance evaluation periods where for everyone within a certain grade, so a certain band, we had numbers. Like I came in as a grade 6 and then I got promoted to a grade 5 as a new PhD. If you came in with a new bachelor's,
promotion, I'm just saying.
Yeah, well, the president of MRL was grade 1, so it went down. And so individually, we would sort of rate our individuals, and then we had to sit in the meeting with all the managers, and everyone within a certain grade had to be ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So on and so forth. And once we're having this meeting, and within my group, we had sort of taken this project that had been around for a long time and had figured out something really critical. We didn't quite solve the whole thing because whole genome sequencing wasn't cheap enough at that point, but we had a major insight. And so there are these two people, and the question is who's number 1 and who's number 2, and there's my person and there's the other person. And the head of our department says, you sort of figure out who's 1, who's 2, and people are giving their arguments. It's not just the direct supervisors, but people who have worked with them have to weigh in on this as well. And my department manager finally says, there's no question both of these people have done a great job. But the question is, what were the expectations? Mm-hmm. Right. And he said, for this person who wasn't the person working for me, they delivered. There's no question that they delivered, but it was pretty straightforward. And, this was something we've done before, and we knew what the expectations were. And he said, for this person, the person working for me, he says, I honestly thought that was never going to work. And I looked up and I'm like, wait a minute. What do you mean you thought it was never going to work? He said, you came to me with this idea. I thought you were nuts. But you didn't tell me? He says, no, I figured it was worth a shot, right? Like maybe you had seen something that other people had missed and it worked out well. And I said, so what would have happened if I was totally wrong? And he goes, oh, that would have been reflected in your performance evaluation. I thought, good to know. But that was the moment when I realized that, my person was being given credit for really having this novel contribution, right? And when I stopped and thought about what success would look like if I stayed at Merck, it would mean moving up the management ladder, right? You're trying to get your grade numbers to drop. So I go from being just my little group to being a group leader where I have other PhDs under me to being a department head and so on and so forth. And that would have meant moving further and further away from that experience. Right. Whereas the one thing that's the same in academia, everything else around you changes. The students, they're always there.
That's right.
There's a new crop that comes in every year. There's a crop that's graduated out. Yep. And so every year you have this opportunity to go through that process of taking someone who's really enthusiastic, not necessarily very skilled, right? but really enthusiastic and really smart. Yes. And your job is to not screw it up, right? Don't take their smart and undo it. Right. But to actually give them the appropriate space as well as the right guardrails to have them realize their full potential. And so I always say every time the day a student of mine defends their thesis is both the happiest and the saddest day of my life. It is very happy because you see them really come into their own, but it's very sad because you're like, this is when you're like at peak productivity, right?
I want you working with me.
This is, we can really do some stuff now. And you let them go and you get your next crop of little baby birds and you teach them how to fly.
Yeah. So it's so funny because I started by saying that I love how you can tell stories and how you teach, and that one really like pulls it all together. It is both. I think that if I were in your classroom, I would feel both that sense of space and that sense of guardrail that you bring to the students to let them grow their wings and
Yes, that's
excel, right?
it is certainly the goal. I mean, I think for me, one of the things I think a lot about is the difference between being in academia and being in industry. And then when I worked at Merck, there was no question why I was doing what I was doing, right? And I'm not going to pick on other industries, but other industries, you can kind of be like, really, if you disappeared, would it matter? If you're in pharma,
yeah,
right? You were there. Every project you were working on, is tied to a disease, right? There's never any question about it that what you're doing is very much focused and very driven. And so the big picture was always really clear to see. But when you are in a large company, it's hard to understand the significance of your individual contribution, right? So you get this really clear sense that you're part of the machine, mm-hmm. and the machine is moving towards making life better for people. But your own place in that is really, really hard to see. What I have really enjoyed about my academic career is I see who's being impacted.
Yeah.
Right. I have relationships with the people who are growing and who are thriving and who are figuring out how they're going to make their marks on the world. And it gives me the opportunity to amplify whatever my message is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And hope that other people will leave my research group or leave my classroom thinking about things in a way that's about what can I do to play my part in making the world better when I leave it than it was when I got here. Mm-hmm. So I find that my impact, I think, is much more personal. Mm-hmm. I have no idea what people are going to do. They're going to do some great things, right? And I'm going to get zero credit for it, but that's fine, right? Like it's enough for me to know that what I am doing is playing my part to make sure that when the young graduates leave MIT, they're doing that ready as they can be to actually make the world a better place.
Yeah. Well, I can cite and give you credit for some of the wonderful students that you have launched into the world, because they have joined the BioBuilder community and are mentoring our students.
Oh, lovely.
Science innovators and engineers themselves. So it is really a very virtuous circle that you have built. And
that's the plan.
They do give you credit. They do cite how important your teaching of them was, and how they still think of all that you've taught them. So
that's good to know.
Good to know.
You never know. It's like, we have kids, right? You raise the kids. You just don't know if the kids are going to give you credit for anything. So
blame, yes. Credit, we hope.
Exactly. So that's very good to hear.
They're great. So Kris, thank you so much. You're an amazing, wonderful friend. And
right back at you.
So grateful to be able to work together. It's wonderful. So
good to see you. Thanks so much for the invitation.